Good. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another in the series of CITRIS Research Exchanges. My name is Gary Baldwin. I'm the Director of Special Projects for Energy and the Environment at CITRIS. And today we are very fortunate to have a tag team presentation on something that we're calling the Climate Navigator. Before we get into that, let me extend my greetings to those who are watching on the web, especially to our sister campuses at UC Davis, UC Merced, and UC Santa Cruz, and all of the other people who are watching live on the web. Let me also thank Infineon Technologies for their generosity in supporting this series of seminars. They're responsible for the lunch that you're eating here in Berkeley and the food that's being served elsewhere. I would first like to introduce Professor John Zysman of the Department of Political Science here at Berkeley and the Director of the Berkeley Roundtable on International Economics, who would like to say a few words of why this Climate Navigator exists. So he's going to set the stage, and then I will be joined by my colleagues here in talking about more of the details of the Navigator. So John, please.
Thank you, Gary. First of all, I'd say it's the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. For those of you who know academic disciplines, if you use the word economics, you actually have to have a union card. And if you use the word economy, it doesn't require a union card. So in any case, let me just say why this came about and why it mattered, and Gary will tell you a great deal more of the history. One of the things that's clear is that it's not just a matter of building the technologies to try and address the climate problem. A great portion of the problem is actually structuring and addressing the debate in a way that policymakers and the business community can actually engage with the issues. In the case of policy, define the right directions. In the case of businesses, figure out ways in which they can make money, or else they're not going to do a lot of this. So part of the purpose of this tool was to try and create a way in which those of us in this community and those we would engage with could help structure in that debate. What are the crucial issues? What are the crucial fights? Running from issues about policy, is price sufficient to drive these changes? Do you need innovation policy? On through the particular domains of technology that are involved. What are the appropriate strategies for solar? What really is possible? When is it possible? And the like. That said, if we're able to do this, one, it's a contribution. Many people want it. And secondly, it would give the UC system, CITRIS, and the Berkeley campus, a way of being able to, in a sense, take control of part of the discussion and the debate and in shaping that debate. But that means involving, as you'll see, it's not a matter of top-down here. It really is a matter of creating a vehicle for everyone to get involved with. So the origin of this actually began in conversations with the Copenhagen Climate Council, which, as Gary will explain, is the parapublic vehicle that was created with the Danish government as part of the lead-in to the post-Kyoto negotiations in Copenhagen, in which the Danish government wanted a vehicle that involved science, involved the business community, and involved the non-strictly governmental policy community to lobby it for the right things, because once you're in a pure government-to-government negotiations, everything gets very rigid. So the purpose of the Copenhagen Climate Council was to create that vocabulary. For a whole variety of reasons, CITRIS has been centrally involved in the technology discussions of that, and the request for a climate navigator of this sort really came out of that. So this vehicle and all of your participation with it, if you're interested, will actually go publicly live at the business summit of the Copenhagen Climate Council in Copenhagen in late May. So this is really more of an invitation than a explication of truth. It's really how do we all participate in shaping where this discussion goes. And with that, let me turn this over to Gary, and I'll go retreat to the back of the room.
Thank you very much, John. So let me give a very little bit of background before I introduce my colleagues who have actually done all the real work on this. A little bit of background, as John talked about. In June of last year, we were invited by the Copenhagen Climate Council to host a conference in Copenhagen to set the stage for a series of meetings leading up to the UN negotiations that will take place this December in Copenhagen. And so we had a CITRIS Copenhagen conference on climate and energy. I thought it was quite successful. It was a rather small meeting, about 200 people, with distinguished keynote speakers, the Secretary of Energy, who at that time didn't know that he was the Secretary of Energy, CEOs of energy companies worldwide, high-level scientists, major participation from people at Berkeley Laboratory and from the Berkeley campus, and basically from around the world. And the purpose, the assignment that we got out of this, one of the assignments that we got out of this meeting was how do we move the debates that took place at the conference into real time on an ongoing basis. And as John mentioned, how do we take charge of sort of structuring that debate and involve a broad worldwide community in that process. And we have created something called the Climate Navigator, which my colleagues Mark and Nina are going to talk about. And what we're going to do today is tell you some of the details and invite you to become active participants in that process. We've been assisted and supported very generously by a grant from Microsoft Corporation in developing the web tool that we will demonstrate live. And of course, want to express our gratitude and support, our gratitude for the support and guidance of the leadership of CITRIS and of others here on the Berkeley campus. Our interactions have primarily been, as John has already said, with the Copenhagen Climate Council in Denmark and with an organization called Monday Morning, which is a Danish think tank, puts out a publication every, wait for it, Monday morning, that people read on Sunday nights before they go to their governmental offices, so they know they know where the bodies have been buried and who's a person they should be talking to that day. And finally, let me thank BRI, which John spoke about, the Berkeley Roundtable for International Economy, I guess, and all of the staff there for helping. So with that, let me introduce first Mr. Mark Huberty, who is a graduate student researcher in the Department of Political Science and with BRI. And he comes to Berkeley in search of a PhD, doing research. But he also comes from a background of a lot of experience in the business community before he returned to Berkeley and has a lot of expertise, especially in the IT sector. And so he's going to talk first. And then I think if Nina's voice holds up, Ms. Nina Kelsey, who is also a student and a student researcher with Professor Zysman, both of whom have been working on this project, I should say, for at least the last year. They've been the people doing the real work. Nina also has a background in science and from the business community, both of them having been with consulting firms before coming back to Berkeley. So I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to lead us through an explanation of what the Climate Navigator is and a demonstration. So Mark, I believe you're first up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Before we launch into really discussion of what the Climate Navigator is, I want to try and motivate where this comes from in the context of the climate debate that we've already had. And this is a debate that we're all fairly familiar with, and we're fairly familiar with the organizations that really helped bring it to some kind of conclusion. So what we knew inside the climate science community was that we knew a lot of stuff about a lot of things that were driving changes in the international, or in the global economy, or in the global climate, sorry. My other day job is kicking in. We knew that there were things happening with greenhouse gas emissions levels that were building up in the atmosphere. We knew it was doing things to ocean chemistry. We knew it was doing things to cloud chemistry. We knew it was doing things to surface temperatures and rates of ice melt and whatnot. In order to make all of this digestible to policymakers, in order to make it something that they could engage with, that they could think about acting on, in order to make it something that the general public was able to understand and think about how they were going to engage with this information in a way that it meant something to their daily lives, that it meant something to the kinds of decisions they made, you had to take that conversation, which was a conversation among scientists, and move it into the realm of being able to say not simply what's going on, but what do we know with some amount of certainty? How do we know it? And why do we think that this is right? We all know that scientific debates, usually the stuff that's going on at any given moment, you're arguing about a lot of minutia, right? Is it this kind of cloud chemistry or that kind of cloud chemistry? Underlying that, though, is this huge amount of developed, agreed-upon knowledge that is actually sufficient for individuals, for governments, whatnot, to try and figure out how they take decisions. And in order to do that, in order to make those kinds of pronouncements about what the scientific community as a climate science community believed, and was willing to put a stake in the ground on, that didn't just happen by virtue of people going to conferences or publishing papers. There was a whole infrastructure that was developed in order to really bring that to fruition. And that's not just the International Panel on Climate Change, although that was a major international coordination effort among a lot of different scientific disciplines to try and say, again, what do we know? What are we confident in? And what are the uncertainty bounds on that? And do those uncertainty bounds mean that we think this is a real problem? And the answer, of course, eventually was yes. We do think this is a real problem. But it was also a lot of other kinds of organizations that took that message out and really communicated it to a much broader audience. So you had everybody from people, from some fairly prominent climate scientists who chose to use sort of blogs and that kind of thing. So you may be familiar with Real Climate, which has some fairly prominent people on it. You had the movie industry in the form of Al Gore. And then you had major NGOs, like the Pew Center on Climate Change and a bunch of others. And these were all more or less organized around the idea of trying to take a lot of information that was inside the scientific community and translate it into a format that's useful for people who don't operate in that world every day and who are trying to use this information to make decisions as to how they implement policy, how they take investment decisions if you're in the business world, how you make purchasing decisions if you're a consumer, how you make voting decisions if you're a citizen. And this is basically a big coordination problem, right? Our argument is that this coordination problem also holds for climate change mitigation. The debate about climate change, except for some remaining cranks out there, is more or less resolved. Now what we're really trying to do is get to the point where we agree on how we move forward on this. But that is fairly complicated. It might even be more complicated in a way than climate science to begin with, because at least with climate science, it's this thing that's out there, right? There's an atmosphere, there's human intervention in it, but you kind of know the thing you're studying. Here we've got a coordination problem where we know that there are a lot of different technologies that we can use in order to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. There are a lot of different policy models. As Professor Zysman alluded to, you've got the debate between do we have a carbon tax or do we have a cap and trade system? That's only one version of that policy model debate. And you have a huge number of options for business. Everything from what BP is doing up on the Hill, making major investments with public universities, people who are trying to implement new technologies and rolling out and sell them on the basis of their energy efficiency. And the real question is, how do we structure the debates both within each one of these things and between them? Because ultimately, it's the structure, it's all three of these things acting together in some fashion that's going to lead to some kind of policy which makes sense. Which brings us to the basic problem, which is that what we're facing here is a systems transition. And the systems transition is a fundamental transformation of the energy basis of the economy. If we didn't have an economy that was fueled on the basis of carbon energy, we wouldn't have a greenhouse gas problem. Plain and simple. Therefore, what we're really looking at in the developed world is a move from high emissions economies to low emissions economies, and the developing world a move from lower emissions economies. I'm not sure we'd call China a low emissions economy, but they would say on a per capita basis, we're not yet there, to a low emissions economy. But what makes these things systems transitions is that in the case of the developed world, it can't happen without major sacrifices to the living standards of the citizens. And it can't happen with the deindustrialization of the economies. Or none of these things are ever going to survive democratic political processes. They will be voted down. In the case of the developing world, it means a move from poverty to prosperity even as you're pulling this off. Because if it doesn't, no sane government in the developing world is going to invest in this without this. If you're China right now, you are deathly concerned that your big poverty alleviation effort is just ground to a halt in the face of the global financial crisis. And if you don't do something about it, you may be facing real social unrest. Investing in this, if this is precluded, stops being an issue. So what you're really looking at is a systems transition that is embracing both the way in which the economies operate on an energy basis while preserving most of the rest of everything that we associate with what the economy is generating right now. And the view that we take on this is that system transitions are basically a coordination problem. They've got a lot of moving parts in them. In this case, the technologies that end up being selected on, the way the businesses implement those technologies, the policy models that are developed in order to set the rules of the market in which those technologies and businesses operate. And so what we need to figure out a way to do is to find a way to have this conversation about climate change mitigation policy and about climate change mitigation in general that doesn't just think about, as sometimes the debates are wont to do, the technology piece, doesn't just think about the governmental piece, doesn't just think about how businesses make money in the future, but tries to integrate these things all together. The flip side of this, if it doesn't happen, is that it's pretty possible, and we'll talk about a couple examples how this is already happening, that if we only think about this, we're making changes here that don't get reflected here, and those changes don't go anywhere. We're making changes here not knowing what's going on with technology, and the policies don't have any effect. So 2 examples of this, one bad and one hopefully better. I think we're all pretty familiar with US biofuels policy. Not to put too fine a point on it, but at some very basic level, it is agriculture policy dressed up as energy policy at the moment. US biofuels policy is basically a set of seed grants for second-generation biofuels that might have real contributions to greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and large subsidies to farmers in places like Nebraska and Iowa to grow corn and soybeans. That's not the only problem with it, though, because as you start to think through the biofuels problem, if we're going to select on ethanol as an interim solution to the emissions problem for cars, that's a major transformation in the underlying energy use infrastructure in the United States, because none of the engines in cars right now can burn ethanol. So you've got a major capital investment there that has to take place. But that assumes that ethanol 20, 30 years from now is going to come out as the winner in the biofuels debate, and it's not at all clear that that's true. You can also make biofuels that are based on hydrocarbons that look much more like diesel fuel. So if that happens, if that ends up being the better way to do it, you now have another huge capital transition that has to take place to the tune of a couple 100 million vehicles. Likewise, the business model problem is pretty bad. A lot of these ethanol producers in Iowa actually don't make money on a very regular basis because they're entirely tied into the commodity price fluctuations of corn. And so it's a fairly unstable business model. And of course, there's a lot of controversy at the international economy level about whether or not this drove food price shortages. So there's a real systems transition issue there that really wasn't thought through all the way when people started selecting on biofuels as the way to solve the emissions problem for cars in the United States. The alternative example, and the better one, is something called Project Better Place, which you might be familiar with. It's this man, Shai Agassi, who's Israeli. And his idea for this is that the real solution here isn't some new fuel, it's a totally new way to sell cars. The basic problem with electric cars has always been the same. Well, really twofold. One, you've got to buy a new car, which is expensive. And 2, you've got to figure out a way to recharge this thing all the time. And then you have to figure out what you do with the battery when the battery runs out, which is what a bunch of Prius owners are about to try and figure out. His solution to this is to not think about the car the way we think about the car, which is that you own the entire thing, and to not think about recharging as something you only do when you can plug your car into a wall for 6 hours at a time. So it's a technology solution, which is a car in which the battery is independent of the car. It can be swapped out. It's an energy distribution problem, which is to say you piggyback on top the existing motor fuel vehicle infrastructure in the United States, in other words, gas stations. And what you have there is you have big banks of batteries that are easily swapped out of cars. So you've always got a battery that's recharged and ready to go on a fairly regular basis. And you've got, in addition to this, a novel sales mechanism. He's talking about selling cars the way we sell cell phones, where the real value of the car isn't so much the car. It's the subscription model where you keep on buying the batteries from it. And so he's talking about a move to a situation in which the incremental cost of buying the car is very low, same way incremental cost of changing your cell phone every 2 years is very low. But the ongoing cost is recouped in the form of renting out these batteries again and again and again. So you've got a technology change, a business model change, and then he's running around selling it as a policy model change too, because he can go to places like Denmark, which has a lot of wind energy. Wind is very intermittent, right? It doesn't generate baseload power very well, but it blows at night when nobody else is using energy. He thinks he can sell the Danes on a policy model for renewable energy that uses wind energy at a very large scale and uses the excess power generated at night to charge all his batteries, which are sitting in gas stations all over Denmark, and powers the entire vehicle fleet for Denmark. So now you've got a policy model change, which is implementing a whole lot of other technological changes made possible through thinking about technology and business models in a slightly different way. So this is the kind of debate that we're really talking about trying to frame vis-a-vis the Climate Navigator. And what does this really mean? It means we've got to figure out a way, ultimately, to connect people across a bunch of different domains that normally don't talk to each other in the way that they probably need to in order to pull off this kind of coordination. Most of the people in this room fall in the first box, the technology box. You've got a lot of business people, everybody from the financiers on Wall Street, if there are any left, to the people making investment decisions in Silicon Valley, who are actually very well connected, to places like GE, British Petroleum, that kind of thing. And getting all those conversations then tied in with the conversations going on Capitol Hill, because there are a lot of people, of course, out there right now who have a vested interest in making sure these conversations don't go anywhere, because they aren't interested in the kind of business model changes that are necessary. So how do you have that conversation in a way that's rooted in what the ultimate goal is, which is a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions? Problem with the business model, problem with the conversation around biofuels, right, is it wasn't grounded in that. It wasn't grounded in how do we get to a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the next 20 years. And so now we've got a system that uses corn and soybeans, by and large, and which, on a life cycle basis, doesn't look like it helps us any much. It also means connecting us across production of energy, how it gets distributed. We thought these were really neat. They're apparently power pylons in Sweden. They look nothing like ours. Anyway, and energy use. And that makes a lot of sense insofar as you think about things like new grid technology, right? The smart grids run on the basis that this piece can make a major difference to how these two things operate. One, because it can help control the energy consumption here. Two, because it can smooth out the demand for energy production here. But to get all that right, you've got to have things at either end of this that are tied into each other. It doesn't make any sense to roll this out if all your appliances are really dumb. And it doesn't make any sense to build baseload power for the expectations of the smart grid if the smart grid never comes to fruition. And so there are two sort of coordination issues here that we're really interested in trying to solve, and for which the infrastructure on the scale that existed with the IPCC, with the climate scientists interacting with the media, these sorts of things, doesn't really yet exist because the debate's just starting. So that gives us a pretty clear idea of what we want to build. We need to figure out some way of being able to answer what is ultimately kind of a simple question. No matter which vantage point you're sitting at, if you're a researcher, business person, policymaker, and you're thinking about this problem, what do you need to know? From what domains to solve ultimately what problem in pursuit of net reductions of greenhouse gas emissions? And to do that, we need some kind of tool that, as both John and Gary said, gives us some idea of how to structure a series of debates about the trade-offs between all the different options in a way that makes those debates give us something useful, right? So the analogy is we can debate a lot about the trade-offs between one kind of solar and another kind of solar at a very detailed level. That may or may not ultimately, those debates may only matter in the context of what we do about land policy in the Southwest United States. Are we really going to cover Arizona in solar cells or not? It may only matter in the sense of what kind of business models are out there that would enable us to produce solar cells at the kind of scale that's going to drive the price to something that is implementable. To give you an example, Japan, for reasons that have nothing to do with or nothing to do with greenhouse gas production, has a very decentralized electrical grid. It has an electrical grid where, unlike here in the United States, power you produce in your home can apparently be fed back into the grid, which is something we can't really do. Japanese companies now are capitalizing on this to subsidize the installation of rooftop solar because it gives them the economies of scale they need in order to get used to how to make solar cells at a fairly high volume and deliver much faster cost reductions for solar technology. So again, we need something that structures this. And for that, we have the Climate Navigator. And what I want to do is very quickly run you through what we consider to be the 4 big domains that we're operating in, give you some example of what it is that we're deploying in one of these domains and how you might interact with it, and then move on to a discussion about how this might prove useful in your own work. Innovation is the piece that's perhaps most obvious. You have a set of technologies. And what we're really interested in is how do those technologies interact with each other? How do they interact with business and policy? How does that change the set of transition barriers that are there, the set of policy options that people might consider? And can we have all of this information set up in such a way that it reflects the essential interconnectedness of these debates? On the regulation side, we know today that all economies don't look alike. That's pretty obvious, right? We don't look anything like Germany. And that has real consequences, not only for the way firms operate and the investment choices they make, but the consequences for workers, the consequences for taxes, lots of things. On the regulation side now, we want to know what happens when you layer the greenhouse gas problem on top of that. What is that going to mean for international trade? What does it suggest about the kind of international deals that might get done places like Copenhagen, the end of 2009? How does the variable landscape of regulation that already exists, and the variable tax people are taking on solving the greenhouse problem going to affect the way that the economy operates and that some of these solutions are going to get deployed? On the road mapping side, we want to deploy some effort to understand how real successes in places like the semiconductor industry in trying to bring together a big diverse group of people who do work on a lot of different kinds of technologies that are needed to make a chip, how we can build on the success that they've had in hitting Moore's Law continuously for 20 some odd years now, which they do through a series of iterated voluntary planning across companies. What kind of lessons that holds for different parts of the climate debate, both in the pure technology end. Semiconductor industry is mostly associated with line widths on silicon, but also in terms of trying to think about how we can apply those kinds of lessons to policy implementation or to how business models might evolve over time. And then finally, on the modeling side, there are a huge number of models out there that are attempting to say what changes in the way our economies operate, the consequences that's going to have for greenhouse gas emissions reduction and vice versa. They exist at all different levels, complexity of geographic, locale, all that stuff. What we're trying to figure out is, number one, how can we take some of these models and make them interactive so that people have a real sense of what's going on at an individual level? But then also, how do we make people better consumers of this by saying what are models good for, what kinds of models are good for certain things versus others, and how do you use this to inform the policy discussion that's going on right now? So to give you a brief hint of what that looks like, this is the innovation section of the Climate Navigator, and as you can see, it's mostly set up by production, distribution, and use of energy. And the interaction on this, in order to contribute information, contribute knowledge, participate in the debates we're trying to capture here, is almost exactly like, if you will, interacting with Wikipedia. Although unlike Wikipedia, we have a certain amount of filtering on the front end to keep out people who are perhaps a bit too innovative in their ideas, if I can use that euphemism. To give you an example of what this looks like, I may really care about biofuels. Right now we have a whole section here on biofuels articles that are trying to capture not only a lot of the stuff about the production, right? So both fairly general stuff, like on biofuel types, all the way through fairly point technologies like cellulose gasification, but then also how that interacts with big policy problems like how does fuel distribution in the United States work, and what does that mean for different types of biofuels? How does U.S. motor vehicle technology work today? What's the installed base look like? How quickly does it turn over, and what does that mean for what might be successful in the future? And as I said, just to give you a brief flavor of this, all of these articles are open for editing and contribution. Looks more or less like a standard Wikipedia interface. And it's open basically to anybody any of you who might be interested to come and participate in the debates, given what's going on in your laboratories, given what's going on with your conversations with policymakers, with business people. Now, right now, we're already up and running on all 4 domains, but we predominantly work in 2 domains right now, biofuels and buildings. And we also have contributions from the cool California people who do these personal greenhouse gas models for California, and also for some work that was done over in ERG on international greenhouse gas emissions and dynamics of different possible agreements. And what we're already planning to be rolled out in the next couple of months is new contributions on wind and solar. We have Arun Majumdar's group up on the Hill working on the High Performance Building Initiative, Hyperbrick. We've been talking with Randy Katz, Professor Randy Katz, a bit about his work on the smart grid and how we can start integrating that. On the regulation side, we have a little bit up there in the United States right now. My specialty is European politics, so we'll be doing that. Nina's specialty is international politics, so we're going to be working on both of those. On the road mapping side, Gary's had very good conversations with people over at the California Energy Commission and PEER, and they've already started doing some of this for California about what the policy, technology, business roadmaps look like for California's energy problem. And we've had and the nuclear people here on Berkeley's campus are interested in this also. And then finally on the model side, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Lab has been working on a number of new models, notably the switch model. And they're, they are in debates there with people like Michael Hanneman, who are doing what I think he calls the BEAR model. These are different models of energy dynamics and economics in California. And there are differences in the models. They come out with some different results. And they, why those things are different and whether or not those differences matter is important to people who are trying to think about how we make use of those models. All of this is really in the run-up to the Copenhagen Business Summit, where we're going to have a very large audience of business makers and global sort of Fortune 500 style CEOs who are going to be interested in this topic. And from our experience in Copenhagen last year in June, are looking for answers like this and are looking for how their own decisions are going to make it possible to do some of these things without heavy-handed government regulation, but also how the changes in technology and policy are going to impact the way that they operate on a day-to-day basis. And so we're looking forward to a very fruitful conversation there and hopefully to a real opportunity to engage the business community. With that, I'm going to turn over to Nina, who's going to talk a little bit about where we go from here and how you might be able to play a role.
And as I talk, I'm going to keep this handy. As Gary alluded to, we had originally had a little more of a tag team plan here, but I woke up with a somewhat unreliable voice, so I'm jumping in at the end and we'll see how this goes. So Mark walked you through sort of the background justification for why we think this tool is needed and what we want it to do, and he showed you the tool itself. In terms of our next steps, we talked about kind of the domains that we're bringing online and the work that we'd like to funnel into this, but really the most important next step is to build an active user community, as we say up there. We need to continue to open new domains and not just put some information up in those domains, but bring in people who are interested in those domains and get them doing that debating, that information aggregation, that synthesis that we talked about. Right now, what we have is something that has a number of articles online, as Mark showed you. It makes certain things accessible, and we think there's value to that. But if we don't bring in that active user base, we will have failed in one of our main goals. So a large part of that, we think, is essentially tied up in uncovering what the domains, the debates that are out there are, in each of the different domains that we're beginning to bring online. And so one thing that we wanted to do with you here is just have a quick conversation with you about sort of what you guys know. First off, I should ask, how many of you are working in areas that have climate or emissions-related applications? All right, so some of you. What I'd like to ask those of you who just raised your hand is, what are the key debates that are taking place in your field? And by that I mean debates around technology. What's the right technological path? How fast can we get things online? Is this really feasible? Debates around business model issues. Is this something we can actually get businesses to deploy, or is it something that would have to go through some other mechanism? And debates about policy. You know, is there a regulatory answer? Is there not? Et cetera. So.
Yes, rather than our normal Q&A at this point, let's open this up to audience participation and anyone who raised their hands, or even if you didn't.
We will have a normal Q&A as well.
We will have a normal Q&A, but at this point, if you have something that you'd like to contribute, Professor Spanos.
So one important debate is whether rooftop photovoltaics make business sense when subsidies go away. The present technology is such that it doesn't say that it doesn't convince anybody who looks into it that they make business sense.
Whether rooftop photovoltaics make business sense. We have another contribution from the back.
I'm, I guess, in the general area of economics, and the key issues are how seriously do we really want to take the future? It comes down to the discount rate problem. And then, given the increasing uncertainty in our understanding of climate change, how the debate should be driven by uncertainty as opposed to what we know.
Each of you introduce yourself.
Okay, so I'm Dick Norgard, Energy and Resources Group.
We had Inoue-san. Did you have a? It
was Costas
Spanos was the other. You want to put those up there? Do we have another contribution? Person interested in raising a debate topic? John, did you want to say something about framing the question, or did that get done?
Nina's basically made the point. Nina's basically made the point. And the issue, the critical issue, what are the critical questions? How do you define them? And how do we then engage debates with excellent people so that everyone wants to come to this site or Berkeley sites or UC sites to engage in those conversations? If we're able to do that, we can own the debate. That would be the objective.
And one thing I would also like to get a sense of is, for those of you who raised your hands, what areas are you working in? What's represented here?
So, Brad. Yes.
Biofuels, atmospheric chemistry.
Biofuels, atmospheric chemistry.
Yeah. Whoops. Here we go.
My field's totally different than anything anybody's talking about. I work in the paleoclimate lab, and our lab looks at what caused us to come into the Holocene, basically. What caused the glaciers to melt, and where we're going from here 10,000 years. So I'm looking way into the future and way back in the past. So there are several things that we think may have caused them, and a lot of them are astronomical. And then one thing, too, in planetary science here, as most people know on this campus, we have Walter Alvarez, who says that asteroid impacts have a huge impact on our planet. And we look at that, too. There's the Holocene working group that looks at asteroid impacts and how they've changed the climate. So it's completely off the topic in a certain sense of what you folks look at here. But it's really relevant to climate change and how climate has changed in the past 10,000 years. Human beings, human beings now sort of rule the earth. 10,000 years ago, we really didn't. And climate was a very important element then.
Other comments?
Other areas? All right, so to take some of these examples, what we would like the Climate Navigator to do is give people a chance to play out these debates, bring to the foreground what needs to be known or is known towards solving those. So to take, for instance, the photovoltaics example, I guess the next question I would ask that I think the Climate Navigator would want to ask is, what what pieces of information do we need to know to solve that? And I don't know if Kostas has some thoughts on that.
Well, there are lots of competing technologies to make, lots of competing photovoltaic technologies. Some of them are suitable for residential use or not, but an educated comparison of these technologies with cost estimates and some projections on how these costs are going to evolve over time will be needed in order to draw some conclusion there.
Are there business model issues? Are there policy model issues? Or is it largely a
There are
question of
certainly
technology?
business model issues and policy model issues. Today's cost is such that without some policies, nobody would put photovoltaics up on the roof. But that's probably not sustainable.
It's too tempting. But then again, you also have to be able to predict future technology trends. So if there's kind of a way to show where progress is being made, and so people can make projections. Because when you say photovoltaic, I agree right now it's not a viable option, but I think it has made continuously progressive gains. And who knows? And if you can show which technologies are evolving, and then also maybe have a thing where what's the potential from a physics or other standpoint, where certain technology, what's the limit that we can look at? That kind of information would be really interesting.
Another way to look at this, Navigator, is that if you could not afford to go to the UN summit in December, where you will be joined by 9,999 of your best friends, what message would you like to take to the UN summit in their debates, and to have them draw a policy conclusion about that is fundamentally going to get us as a species back on the right track? I mean, think at that level. What information would you like them to have that you know about, or that you could take part in distilling, so that you could have that kind of an impact? It's that important to each of us. So your interaction with this tool could have that kind of impact if you would like to contribute. John, you have?
Well, one comment back to the photovoltaics issue, because it's a perfect example, which is assumptions about cost rest on assumptions about production and assumptions about volume. So the question becomes, if, as part of a debate like this, under which approaches to photovoltaics actually are easier to produce, in what volumes do you start to see changes in the production cost parameters? What does a roadmap look like, since that's part of the story here, if people were to engage in a sequence of mutual investments to try and get there? So that, in fact, we all take, as, in a way, as given the parameters that, in fact, we need to turn into variables. And that's a perfectly good instance of that. We all know the Semiconductor Industry Association roadmap. And it really is a powerful vehicle, because it engaged a community in a set of conversations in the ways in which separated decisions could be made that could change, could see how the parameters would change and alter the production characteristics. I think that's going to be true in a whole array of these areas. We need to engage the economic debate and the technical debate in those kinds of ways.
In the sense of an unusual background here, I was a science and technology convener for the Irish Green Party, who are now in power in Ireland, or at least in government. And the question about what to bring to the UN, it's kind of interesting to see the Green Party in government in Ireland making pretty much all the mistakes that we expected them to. And to be frank with you, it's pretty much along the lines of the ethos I'm actually getting from all this. You have a situation currently where there was a Wall Street Journal article last week that essentially $684 trillion in fake money was created by various hedge funds through derivatives. And what I feel about this is that particularly my ex-colleagues essentially believe that the whole neoliberal dispensation is going to continue forever. And essentially all their models are top-down. And they're oriented towards increased consumption by people to increased economic growth. That assumption needs to be looked at, and I think that we may be looking at economic contraction for quite a long time ahead, until that 684 trillion has been cashed out in something or other. But perhaps a more substantial thing here, what they've just announced in Ireland, for example, is a 600 million electricity link, 600 million euro electricity link with Wales. I can pretty much guarantee you that that will never get built. Ireland is already broke, the money's not going to be there. So the question really for the UN people, how much of this stuff can you actually do? Because it looks like the money's not going to be there to do it.
I think this is more just a general question of how much focus should there be on relying on technology to bring down CO2 emissions, and how much focus should we put on changing behavior in society to bring down CO2 emissions, and what policies can be enacted to change people's behavior.
I think that's a fantastic question. Since it's kind of a question, I will answer quickly, and I would say that that's a very important question. It's one of the things we'd like to see debated on the Climate Navigator. Our position is a lot of the stuff that will happen through the economy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will be driven by business, if that makes sense.
Since that was a question, perhaps in the last 2 minutes here, we should open it up to questions and try and answer rather than just the debates. And first, Yvette, do we have any questions off of our viewers on the web? No?
Let me just recap one thing really quickly.
Sure.
Just to wrap this up, the kinds of quick little debates we just had here around, say, photovoltaics and the different types of things that we would need to ask or figure out in order to make photovoltaics work, questions around policy and its relationship to human behavior and so forth. Those are the kinds of things that we want to see on the model. When Mark took you through that, the different domains that he showed you, most of those questions fit in one or the other of those domains. And so our goal here is to get you and many other people in the world interested in actually having those debates online and contributing. So I would very much invite you to check it out. And now we would love to answer any questions.
Hi. So I get nervous every time I hear the phrase business model. Because businesses aren't very well motivated. So for example, there's a reason why the big BP grant at Berkeley is entirely about biofuel. Namely, biofuel is monopolizable. It's something that a big energy company can artificially raise the price of, whereas solar panels on your roof is inherently decentralized. And so it's much, much harder to get funding for that sort of thing. So if you start with the assumption that business models have an equal standing with everything else in the debate is bound to go badly. And the real question is, how can we wrest control of the economy away from people like BP in order to actually make progress?
I actually would like to respond to that. I think I want to separate out the words business model from the question of whether businesses dominate the debate. I mean, I think those are really two very different kinds of questions. On the issue of whether businesses should dominate the debate, I agree with you. On the question of the meaning of the phrase business models, if one doesn't want BP to dominate the debate and wants a decentralized business structure to do that, in a certain sense one needs to construct some kind of viable, sustainable business model that will allow others to try and participate. And then the question becomes, what kinds of policies would favor the kinds of business models you might, and frankly I suspect from what you're saying, I might prefer. So that business model is simply a construct for talking about that, and one shouldn't conflate, certainly in our conversation, the notion of business domination with this, in a sense, vocabulary structure. So the former I would agree with. Then the question is, can you suggest ways in which, what kind of policies would allow the kinds of business strategies, if you will, that you'd favor, and which ones would get in its way, which would be the way I would want to put the question, which business models is just a vehicle for the conversation you want to hold.
If I could give a quick concrete example, one of the well-known problems in the building industry is that currently users of building space essentially pay a flat fee for all of the electricity they use, which means there's no incentive for those users to conserve. And it's really the users in that case that has to do the conserving, that buys the more energy efficient appliances, for instance. So there's been this decoupling between use and the person who has the financial incentive to save the energy. There's a business model change involved there that could bring that coupling back together. A change to a per usage metering of energy for the user that would give the control and the incentives back to the user. That's a business model change, but it's not clear that the drive for such a change comes from within the business community. That might be coming from the outside. It might be a policy change or a regulatory change. So I think that we would definitely agree with that.
One more question? Is there one more? I hear that the Campanile has struck one. Thank you very much for your contributions and your talk. This is an ongoing project. We invite you to become participants. www.climatenavigator.org. We will have a major launch in the 1st of May. But right now we're in soft launch mode, so we invite contributors. Those of you that would like to become contributors, you know who to contact. Thank you very much, Nita. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Professor Zysman.